In 1963, American banks were holding collateral they'd never seen, and it didn't exist. The official story is straightforward. A salesman named Anthony De Angelis committed fraud. He faked warehouse receipts borrowed against phantom oil, and when auditors showed up, the game was over. Clean narrative, prosecutable, done. Except the people who lost the most money weren't fooled by De Angelis, they were fooled by themselves, and that's where the real story begins. By 1963, the commodities market was booming. Salad oil, soybean oil to be precise, was liquid gold. Margarine manufacturers needed it, restaurants needed it. The Cold War had taught American institutions to think in terms of strategic reserves. De Angelis, a 37-year-old trader working for a company called Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation, understood this hunger perfectly. He saw the demand. He saw the leverage. He saw the opportunity. Starting in 1962, De Angelis began a simple operation. He'd store vegetable oil in tanks at the port of New York. Then he'd issue warehouse receipts, documents stating that the oil was there, stored, safe, and available as collateral. Banks would accept these receipts and loan him money against them. The receipts looked legitimate, the warehouse looked legitimate, the numbers were legitimate. What wasn't legitimate was what was actually inside those tanks. De Angelis was storing water. Millions of gallons of salt water topped with a layer of actual oil to fool the inspectors who occasionally dipped their gauges into the tanks. The density difference was his accomplice. Oil floats on water. A quick dip would show oil, a full inventory would show catastrophe, and the banks didn't do full inventories, they trusted the paperwork. Between 1962 and 1963, De Angelis borrowed roughly $150 million against these fake receipts. That's $3 billion in today's money. He used the cash to buy more oil futures, to speculate wildly on price movements, to leverage himself deeper into the market. Each loan expanded his position. Each position made him bolder. He wasn't just committing fraud, he was weaponizing it, turning it into a battering ram against the entire commodities system. The banks lending him money were not backwater operations. American Express, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, these were the names that anchored the financial system. They lent $150 million based on paperwork and reputation. De Angelis had built that reputation carefully. He'd paid his bills, he'd been in the business for years, he seemed stable, under pressure to compete and deploy capital. These institutions made a calculation, the paperwork was good enough. In November 1963, a routine inspection uncovered the first crack. An auditor for the American Express warehousing company noticed something odd. The math didn't add up. The inventory didn't match the receipts. At first, they assumed clerical error, then they assumed theft. Then they dipped a gauge into tank 402 and realized what they were looking at: water, not oil, water. De Angelis fled. He was arrested days later. When authorities opened the tanks, all of them, they found roughly 8 million barrels of oil and 4 million barrels of salt water. The actual commodity value was perhaps $20 million. He'd borrowed $150 million against it. The shortfall was $130 million in a market that had no buffer for that kind of shock. Here's where the story flips. The common narrative pins this on De Angelis, a criminal, a con man, a bad actor operating outside the system. That's the version that lets everyone else off the hook. But De Angelis couldn't have done this alone. He needed the banks to not ask questions. He needed the warehouse company to not inspect thoroughly. He needed the commodities market to not have safeguards. He needed all of these to fail simultaneously. The real story is about what the banks knew they didn't know and decided it didn't matter. They were under pressure to lend. The commodities market was hot. De Angelis had a track record. The paperwork was in order, so they made a decision: accept the risk, move the capital, collect the interest. It was rational under the constraints they faced. It was also catastrophic. American Express Warehousing Company, the supposed guarantor of the oil's existence, had inspected the tanks only sporadically. They didn't require complete physical counts. They didn't mandate dip tests across the full depth of every tank. They relied on the receipts De Angelis issued, which means they were relying on De Angelis to police himself. That's not a system, that's theater. The commodities exchange itself had no circuit breaker. When the news broke, the market seized up. Oil futures crashed. Companies holding positions faced margin calls. The cascade threatened to topple institutions that had nothing to do with De Angelis, but everything to do with the leverage he'd injected into the system. The Fed had to step in and essentially guarantee liquidity to prevent a full collapse. De Angelis went to prison. He served about 5 years. American Express settled claims. The banks absorbed losses, but the real cost wasn't the money, it was the lesson nobody learned. The system had proven it could fail catastrophically because of decisions made under pressure by people who had incomplete information and chose not to get complete information. 40 years later, the same pressure existed. Lenders had incomplete information about mortgages. They chose not to get complete information. They leveraged aggressively. They trusted paperwork. And in 2008, the system failed again, this time not with $150 million, but with trillions. De Angelis had shown the blueprint. The market had simply scaled it. The Great Salad Oil Swindle wasn't a failure of character. It was a failure of structure. The institutions involved made rational decisions given their incentives and constraints. The problem wasn't that one man was corrupt, it was that the system rewarded everyone for not knowing what was in those tanks. Knowledge was expensive, ignorance was profitable, so they chose ignorance. De Angelis died in 1999, relatively obscure. He's remembered as a criminal. The banks that lent him $150 million are still operating, remembered as victims, but they were the ones who decided that paperwork was enough. They were the ones who calculated that the interest income justified the risk. They were the ones who could have demanded transparency and chose not to. That choice was their decision, made under pressure. With what they knew at the time, and it nearly broke the market. Subscribe to see how the same pattern repeats, institutions choosing profitable ignorance until the system breaks.